Are we started?
Yes, you can
I
go.
think we are. Yes, okay. I'm not used to this yet. Welcome everyone to a session on concept map and naming system, how and when to use them, and proposed changes for R5. I see a pretty good group out there, a few folks that that are familiar names. So hopefully this will be of interest, and let's go ahead and get started. Before I do that, I guess I will say that I'm hoping that we can make this fairly interactive. I'm very happy to have you unmute if you have a question, or I'll also be following in the chat, and we'll try to make sure that we catch all the questions. But I think that this is the first time that I've actually gone through this material and tried to put things together, so the slides might not be quite as full as we'd like, and we'll try to go through and just take a look at things as we go along. And I'm happy to entertain your questions and comments and get any benefit from any experience that you have had with these resources, and again, particularly questions about what you've encountered or what you might hope to be able to get out of them. So with that, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. See if I can click in the right spot so I can do that. Okay, so who am I? I am Robert Hausam. I go by Rob. I'm an MD. I'm a family physician. I'm a consultant. My own consulting company in informatics. I've been doing this for quite some time. I've got a background in computer engineering as well as in medicine, and I try to bring those together to the extent that I can. I've been working in the standards world now for quite some time in HL7 since about 2001, and I've been working with FHIR, not from the very, very beginning, but pretty close to it, probably since 2014 or so, something like that. So quite a few years, and working on a number of the FHIR spec itself, as well as a number of IGs and all of that. And do a lot of work with terminology. I'm one of the co-chairs of vocabulary work group, as well as also co-chair orders and observations. All right. So the basic learning objectives for the session, essentially to try to understand the purpose and structure of the concept map and naming system resources, basically to raise the awareness of these resources, is one of my main goals here, and want to consider their potential uses in the FHIR specification, potentially in your FHIR IGs and client applications, and we'll describe a little bit about the new availability and usage of the naming system resource in terminology.hl7.org. We'll get to that, and to raise some awareness of what are the proposed upcoming changes for R5 for concept map particularly, and also a little bit for our naming system resource. So the first thing is to kind of look at where all this lives, and this is front page of the FHIR spec, and categories. We have the terminology resources, we have the CodeSystem and ValueSet resources, which are normative. And then we have the ones that are of interest to us today, the concept map and naming system highlighted there. And then there's also terminology capabilities. This is another terminology resource. This is the R4 page, and it's changed a little bit for the proposed R5 and the CI build, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go along. Okay, so we'll start. I'm going to break this up, basically into kind of two separate halves. As I was thinking about how to put this together, there's really, it's almost like two separate presentations in one. And but we can move back and forth or whatever if we need it. If we have questions and things like that, that's certainly fine. Again, don't hesitate if you have a question to go ahead and speak up. I'm happy to entertain that, and we can kind of take this to whatever directions will meet your needs the best. All right, so this slide just basically gives a a very high level overview what ConceptMap is for. I'm going to make a little bit of an assumption, I guess, that most of you know something about ConceptMap. You probably heard of it or seen it or used it some, I would guess, but I don't know to what extent. And like I said, the base terminology resources, CodeSystem and ValueSet are very heavily used. ConceptMap is not quite so much, and NamingSystem probably even less. But for ConceptMap, it's a list of mappings between concepts from primarily two different value sets. Now we'll see a little bit of a nuance to that. Normally they're going to be from different code systems or potentially models. And so we'll get to that a little more in just a moment. ConceptMap provides maybe one of its most obvious and important uses in the FHIR ecosystem is it provides the mapping data for use in the translate operation. And this is just a table that explains, shows the, a mapping between a source terminology and a destination one, and the equivalence between those or lack of such. Code home here, map to home, code H there, and so forth. And we'll actually see that example here in a little bit. We'll try to look at that live. Okay. So this slide just shows the UML for the resource. Then again, this is the R4 incarnation of it. It actually has had some changes, which we'll talk about, but particularly under target element. We'll get to that here in a little bit. But if you look at equivalence, that will be different in the upcoming R5. And so again, we won't go into details here, but what we might do, it's much harder to show in a slide. So we'll switch over to the browser here for a second, and we'll look at the ConceptMap resource. Again, this is R4, and this is the structure diagram. So we can kind of scroll through here, but basically we have the high level metadata, essentially, lots of details there that we can get into. But when we get down, we get to the source and the target, and we have, we have basic references to source and target value sets. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And then we've got a group element, which basically organizes pretty much all the rest. And it does that so that when you're using ConceptMap, you can do it a bit more efficiently and parsimoniously by not having to repeat the source and the target code systems for every single map element. That was originally, that was actually the case in ConceptMap, and for R4 that was changed to make that easier for folks to use. Hopefully that turns out to be the case. But so we have then we basically have the element with the actual source code, and then the target with code and display, and then the equivalence element, as I mentioned before. And so I think there's a few other things that we can dive into a little bit further if there's time and interest and questions, like unmapped and some various things. But so let me move back to the slide for a second and say a few words about the purpose of concept maps. I think I touched on it already a bit, but it's a statement. Concept map provides a statement of relationships from one set of concepts to one or more other concepts. Those can be either concepts in code systems, or potentially also could be data elements or data element concepts, or classes and class models, or some even potentially a few other things. But those all can be a little bit loosely referred to as a code system. Concept map is broader than our typical familiar use of that within the code system resource and the value set resources. Because we may have other things that sort of form a de facto or implicit code system that we want to do mappings with. And so we try to make make that as flexible and as broad as possible to give it the, have the maximum utility basically from what it can do. So it defines a mapping from a set of concepts defined in a code system to one or more concepts defined in other code systems. But it's a really important thing to be clear on, and that is that the mappings between code system concepts are only intended to be defined within in the context of a particular business usage. Okay, so that's an important thing. And so because of that, some of the features, the way it's organized is, as I showed you before, because the mappings are expected to be context dependent, the source X and target X elements refer to value sets, not to code systems. So you've got the notion being that a concept map may not be, it may not be valid outside of the particular context of use. You might have even potentially within the same two sets of code systems, maps from the two same codes might actually have a different mapping depending on the business use. Now, it might be interesting to explore that a little further and show some examples. We might be able to do that tomorrow. I don't have any on the slides here today that illustrate that exactly, but if anyone has run into that, I'd be happy to hear things, or certainly, again, any questions about that. But another key concept is that mappings are unidirectional. They're intended to only go one way, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. But basically, say thinking about maybe an example would be if you're mapping from SNOMED to ICD-10 or something like that, you might be able to make a pretty precise mapping in the one direction. Maybe you need to generate billing codes from your clinical data or something like that. But if you try to use that map in the opposite direction, there's a lot of assumptions built into those maps that would not necessarily translate in the other direction. So it is possible to traverse the maps in reverse. You can do that using in the translate operation using the reverse parameter. But again, the key point with that, if you do it, is that this notion of kind of mapping in reverse, it basically what it does is it provides the set of source concepts that are mapped to the target. Okay, and that could be a useful thing to know. You might want to be able to explore that. So the reverse parameter may be very useful, but it doesn't mean that the mapping is just, again, completely reverse, and it's actually not, it's not necessarily at all a true mapping that you could rely on from the target to the source. So more on features. Again, I think I touched on this already a bit, but code systems may be actually an implicit code system that's not necessarily based on a recognized terminology. It doesn't have to be SNOMED or LOINC or, RxNorm or FHIR codes or HL7, V2 or any of those things that we often tend to look at. But it might be, some other notion that again can result in a set of concepts. One example that that's not listed on the slide, but you might have a set of medication resources that collectively these are resource instances that you're dealing with, and you might want to map those from terminology that they're coded into another medication terminology. And you could actually use a set of medication resources as your essentially as your value set or code system. Essentially, you could look at it either way probably, but they in the context that you're using, that set of resources could be they could be the source codes for a concept map. All right, so that's the classes and the class models idea there. All right, so let's move on. So I don't have a whole lot, actually, to be honest, in the slides, and I'm interested in hearing other perspectives, now or later in the question time about how anyone has used ConceptMap and where they've used it and where they've thought about using it or wondering if you can and things like that. And we could go into further details on that. But the translate operation I mentioned is the primary obvious thing that people are going to want to do. This is part of FHIR terminology services, and it's a very useful capability to be able to have. And pretty much I think the actual computable use of ConceptMap is maybe entirely limited to the translate operation. There might be other things you can do, but this is the defined operation on it. And so can you translate this particular code that you have to another code system? Uses the concept map to do that. And that's an explicit concept map, like a resource instance, which you'll declare. But some terminologies actually have built-in implicit concept maps, like SnoMedCT has a whole host of what known as reference sets, and there are they can map retired codes to current codes and things like that, and the terminology server can leverage those and treat them as concept maps, even if they were never actually presented to the server in the form of a concept map resource. But it's the same basic idea. So you basically can pass a coding or codable concept, similar to what you do in validate code, and you get an output. Basically, it's if it can be translated, you get a true response. You get a message, an operation outcome, basically, if you can't translate it. And if it is translatable, then you return the translated coding. Okay. And so I was going to try to illustrate what that looks like a bit. Let's see. I don't need to keep track of where I am on time here. Okay. Sorry, 1 second here. Okay, so, all right, so what I'm going to do is excuse me, I'm going to show an example of that, what you saw on the slide before, that address use from FHIR to V3 address use mapping between those value sets. And the concept map resource that's used in the example, we can take a look at that first. When I click on this, it's going to bring it up in the browser. It won't look real pretty because I can't really make it pretty on the server. This server happens to be the term-in server from New Zealand. That's basically put together and hosted by Peter Jordan. Yeah, it's a very, very nice server. It's got some very good features, particularly for what we're going to try to show today here in a moment. But let's see, it should come up. But it doesn't look real pretty when you see it this way. It doesn't do a pretty print. So I've gone ahead and taken care of that and copied that over to Visual Studio Code here, and we can take a look at what the concept map resource actually looks like in a little more readable form. Hopefully the size on the screen is okay for you. I tried to expand it a little bit, so hopefully that's good. Let's see, so we've got, anyway, so so this is bundle returning the search set with the URL. So this is the concept map resource here. And of course the metadata, we can just go through that for a moment. We've got source URI and target URI references to two value sets. Again, the FHIR address use value set and the version 3 address use value set. And then we've got in our group, again, we specify here and the group source and group target specify code systems. And so essentially the URLs are almost the same, but they're not quite. These are the code system URLs. And so they're, any sets of, source codes and target codes that are in that group will use those same code systems. That's the way that works. So under element, then the element.code is the source code. In this case, it's the code lowercase home, and the display term is the same. And then our target, we have the map is the code of H. Okay, and then we got a display term, and then we say if that mapping holds, that's an equivalent mapping. Again, if we get to R5, this element's going to be different, and I'll show that here in just a little bit. But anyway, so we've mapped the code home, we've mapped the code work, and we have a couple of others, and then we also have a disjoint, which is basically something that we consider not to be a valid mapping, and we're going to say that that would not be returned in your translate operation. So that's what the ConceptMap resource looks like. And I'll close that and go back to the slides. So next slide. So now we'll go ahead and perform the translate operation. And we'll do that we'll translate. Again, let me just go through the translate URL here a little bit. So we're going to specify the system, and that's the code that we're translating, and the code for that. So that's the code home in the FHIR address use code system. And then we will specify the source value set and the target value sets. Okay, and that basically is how we're identifying which concept map to use. Now you could do the translate directly on the concept map ID if you want to specify the concept map, but typically you're going to want to let the terminology service do those kind of things behind the scenes. And basically, what you want to know is again, for this this code that you have in a particular code system, and based on these source and target value sets, you want the server to be able to find and tell you what the proper mapping of that is. And you might also, I think Jim Steele yesterday, I believe, mentioned this in his presentation, but you might actually do this based on context. You don't even have to necessarily specify the value sets. You can say the element context that you're working in. It could be sufficient because it's bound to particular value sets, and you can use that to have the terminology server know what is the proper concept map to use. So that part is pretty much behind the scenes. But anyway, we'll go ahead and run the query here and get a little smaller set of things. And I also already have that on here. So this is our output that we receive. So we get a parameters resource, and we basically have a match, and we say that match is equivalent. And so basically we have what we return is the target concept, and that's that code H that we talked about in the v3 address use code system. The actual source concept is not actually returned in the output, but you know that that's what you input to the query. And so and I can't remember, to be honest, if you might be there may be a way to force or to ask the server nicely to return that. I don't remember if we've actually included that or not. I should check that out. But anyway, that's what you get. So let me close that. All right. So moving on. All right, so talk a little bit about proposed changes for R5 and ConceptMap. Let me just look at where we are on time. Okay, I might have to. So the big one is the equivalence element. Equivalence element, like I talked about. That's being replaced by a relationship element in R5. That's a pretty significant change, and we do use ConceptMap throughout the FHIR specification, and for a lot of things, it's built in, baked into it basically. And when we made this change, we had a lot of work to do, and we had, of course, change all the translate, basically the version translation, code, and it's quite a big change. It's because ConceptMap is a conformance resource, and hopefully we will get it to eventually to a mature level, but I'll talk about that here in just a second. So let me quickly just show you the difference. I think we should take a look at that. I showed you already the equivalence element here under target. And if we pull up the the continuous integration version, proposed R5, you see basically the same thing here with, but then we get into group. When we get down to target, we basically have code display and then a relationship element. And there's a difference between the value sets that are bound here. You see that on equivalence, we had, what is it, 7 or 8 codes or something like that. We had a related to it kind of at the top, which I'll go ahead and click in here. It's easier to see how that works, but related to is at the top. And then we had equivalent. We also had equal. And a lot of people had trouble determining when you use one versus the other, how would you determine what's actually equal? And there's a similar notion with wider and subsumes. And what's the difference? Well, the difference is supposed to be because the subsumes uses the is a relationship, but I mean, not every code system actually explicitly talks about an is a relationship, and but they may have the same idea about it, and then really it's hard to have a reliable distinction. And the same is true with narrow and specializes. So we looked at that and decided we needed to make that simpler. And then we had some other things within exact, unmatched, and disjoint we thought were a little complex too. So instead, in R5, what we have replaced it with, or will be replaced with, is this, quite a bit simpler value set. We're related to still at the top. Basically, the opposite of that is not related to, obviously, but it's the reason we have that is to make an explicit assertion. If you want to do that, the target concept is not related to the source concept, rather than just sort of leaving that to chance. But as far as the subtypes related to, you've got equivalent, and again, no equal here anymore, because really, again, they're not reliable. And then to be very clear about the direction of the mapping, that was one of the criticisms of the earlier value set, because the notion was you mapped, you looked at the target and you compared it to the source, but the relationships go from source to target, and that is it source to target or is it target to source was very confusing. And so the agreed upon solution was to make that very explicit in the code. So in this case, it's source is narrower than target, or source is broader than target. So it happens though that source is narrower than target is the same as the broader, or wider actually, because that word was changed, but same as wider in the R4 version. And that could be a little confusing to folks maybe, and so narrower in the R4 version becomes source is broader than target in the upcoming R5. So that's the biggest change. And so the other thing is that now these, both the resources actually, both ConceptMap and NamingSystem are now canonical resources instead of domain resources. They're also listed as a metadata resource. And I just actually just recently realized that, and I'm going to have to clarify that with Graham, because they're declared, if we look at it, back here, they show up here as, sorry, I went too far, as a canonical resource, and extra elements that are inherited, but they're listed also as a metadata resource, but they don't show up this way. So I think that seems a little inconsistent. I'll have to clarify that. But the other thing is maturity level. It was, ConceptMap was maturity level 3 in R4, but we've reduced it actually to 1 currently in the CI build. And that's because of these rather significant and definitely breaking changes in the relationship elements and value set. So we hope to bring that maturity level back up for the publication of R5, but we're not exactly sure where it will end up landing. That's good to be aware of. All right, so now let's see how much time. don't have too much time left, actually, I guess. Naming system. I probably should have talked a little faster, but naming system, you know, I'll cover the key points, and then we'll spend at least try to have another, you know, at least five or, you know, hopefully 10 minutes for questions. Naming system identifies the existence of a code or identifier system. Kind of one of its key things is it's typically defined by third parties and not the code system or identifier system owner. So, you know, SNOMED wouldn't publish a naming system for, you know, SNOMED International wouldn't publish a naming system resource, probably, you know, for SNOMED art, you know, SNOMED CT, but other people might, you know, for various reasons and things like that. So let's skip on here. The purpose is basically to be a curated namespace that issues unique symbols within the namespace and, you know, for identification of concepts, people, or devices, things like that. So it's a system used within both either the identifier or the coding data types. So coding.system can be from a naming system resource. And not necessarily every bit of tooling fully might support that, but the specification certainly does. And it's also could be used in, again, to declare identifier systems. So there may be, in that way, there may be some overlap with code system, but the difference is, again, as I mentioned, is who creates and manages the resource. You know, it's third parties that do naming systems, you know, for, you know, because then basically they may need to do identifier or, you know, code system mappings and declare and kind of track the, you know, the changes of those over time. So let's, features, I'm not listing any specifically here. We can talk about that more as we go along. So where can you use it? Preferred ID. And actually, this slide is inaccurate, and I messed that up. So I apologize. I can't show you for an example, but we will cover that tomorrow in the session. We'll go into both the preferred ID and also the proposed translate ID operation. I'll be able to show you those. So yeah, we'll skip over that. So changes to naming system for R5, not nearly as significant. The main one is just like ConceptMap, naming systems now a canonical resource. And it inherits some new elements because of that, which make it more useful for things that, particularly one of the new uses that we're seeing for it. It's another slide here, so I'll go back to this one. It's here, the new usage of the naming system in, this says THO. You all may not be familiar with that. That's that stands for terminology.ho7.org, which is also known as UTG. We've been calling it the UTG project for a long time, but the official name of it is terminology.ho7.org, and yeah, it's just easier to say THO. So THO or UTG, it provides, or at least it intends to provide, a naming system for all HL7 managed code systems, not for value sets, but for code systems. It only uses the kind equals code system. And we're using it there for audit trail of any URI and ID changes in those resources. And so that'll be, kind of important thing to be following as we go along. I'll just quickly, very briefly show you.
Rob?
Yes.
I got word from Julie that I was allowed to ask you directly.
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
Since chat is disabled, I couldn't say yes to her. Where was my question? I posted it in the session Q&A. If you look at naming system, you can define connections between OIDs and URIs. And as you know me, I'm from an OID background.
Yes, absolutely.
The FHIR spec says thou shalt use URIs if specified.
Right.
So it's not possible to say, well, use OIDs and look up in naming system if it happens to be SNOMED, for example. Would you say that the main purpose for a naming system is about documentation of metadata around a code system or an identifier system, or does it have any runtime purpose?
That's a good question, Alexander. I think it's a bit of both. It's been a bit of a poor stepchild, actually, to be honest. I mean, from some people have used a lot of it, only a few, I think. and mostly it's been used for the documentation purpose that you described. I think, basically declaring, these are a set of identifiers that reference this particular code system, whatever. And so you can see what's out there. You can say, well, there is this OID, and that does reference SnowMidCT, but there's the URL, and it's labeled as preferred, and things like that you can do with it. But it's mostly for documentation. However, there are operations on it, and I think, and there's one existing one which quickly we can just speak at, which is the preferred ID that I was going to show you, but I will tomorrow. So it it basically can tell you. You can ask what's the preferred ID, because there's one that particularly that would be marked, and we'll go into details about that later. But that may not be the main thing that you actually care about. What you really might want is, I think what you're asking is, maybe I've got data that's using the OID, and I'd like to have, and maybe that's coming from CDA, and I'm trying to convert that to FHIR resources or something. And so I'd like to be able to translate that to directly to the to the proper URL for SnowMidCT, and the proposed translate ID operation is exactly for that purpose. So it's going to have some runtime capabilities and importance, I think. So hopefully, I don't know if that answers the question or not, but
I can see it could have potential. Do you have any knowledge of connectathons where it's been tested, used that way?
We haven't. It's about time that we want to, and we've been talking about doing it. At least not to my knowledge that we have. We haven't done it really in the HL7 connectathons, and I don't know if other people may have exercised this, but I'm not aware of any at all. So, but we do. We've listed it the last few times in the terminology track, and we are putting together, even as of today, we're putting together the terminology track proposal for the January Connectathon, and we are, we're going to propose exercising this. So it would be coming, and if you're interested, that would be great, or if any other people are as well. So this is the last bit of slides, and just what did you learn? This is going over the things that we just covered, and then we'll plan to further explore these, and maybe show some more useful and interesting and maybe real examples in the session tomorrow. And I'd love to have all of you contribute again more questions that we could explore tomorrow, and any examples that you have personally run into where this is useful, or where you think it could be useful and you want to find out, and things like that, and anything that we can further explore. So, all right. So there's contact information for me if you want to email me, and of course you can get me on Zulip, and of course the Whova app. Hopefully, if I pay attention to it, I'm not real good about doing that actually, but I'll try. And while we're here at DevDays, and then we're Q&A. So let's see how we're doing. I'm not sure what our end point is, but they'll tell me. I know they'll flash the screens up. So, all right. Do we have other questions? And I didn't see a question show up in that section of the app, so I don't know if I missed something. Oh, there are some. Oh, I do see them now.
Question. Yes.
Yeah,
okay.
there are some. Sorry, they didn't refresh on my screen. I apologize for that. I missed them. Let's see. So let me see if I can go through these here, and then we can ask more if we still have time. FHIR spec defines a number of concept maps, but is there a registry for concept maps on public terminology servers beyond that? Well, the terminology.ho7.org that I just showed you is at least that's the best start of that I know of. We may need other things. We may, registry.fhir.org. Honestly, I haven't looked for naming systems there. I don't know if there's anything like that there. I'm not sure that there is, but that might be something that could be fleshed out. So, but right now, THO would be the place I would look, and at least for HL7 related things. If it's others, that may or may not be entirely helpful. But if there are needs out there, speak up, and we can, we'll see what the community is needing and try to provide it. So, next question, let's see, did HL7 create a concept map for the changes from R4 to R5 in relationship type? It sounds like a candidate. Yes, it sure does. And the interesting answer is, I don't believe we have, actually. We certainly it's an obvious thing that we need to do. But I don't remember if we have an open ticket for that. But that's a very good question, and I'll try to make note of that. And if you feel like putting in a JIRA ticket on that, that would be useful. Make sure it doesn't fall through the cracks. I don't think it will, but that's a very good question. Next one, would it be possible to have FHIR resources and elements as target codes? Well, I think the answer is yes. I don't think I've seen anyone exercise that. I'd like, if you had some examples of things you might be considering, I think it'd be worth exploring, and we could talk about that more tomorrow, and I can try to think about it a little bit more between now and then. And again, if I see any particular examples that you have, it's quite a bit of flexibility there. So yeah, I think the answer is at least a qualified yes. Okay. So next question, is the relation in a concept map uni or bidirectional? It's clearly a unidirectional. That's its intent. It's not to say that you couldn't, again, people could treat it as if it's bidirectional if at their own risk, basically. They could use the reverse, reverse parameter on, excuse me, on translate, to do that, and they can do it, use it any way they want, or they could read the concept map resource themselves that way. But it's again, because you can't guarantee that. If you want to have a bidirectional mapping, you actually need to make both maps and you make the map in both directions. That's the correct and preferred way to do that. Okay. Next one is, can you give an example of a mapping that's not between traditional code systems? Well, I think I tried to do that. Maybe I can show a real example tomorrow. That's a good point. But I'll try to show one. I've used them in some of the IGs I have. We're doing mappings in the LIVID project, which is Loink in vitro diagnostics, building an IG, and we're mapping mapping observation definitions. Basically, we're using those as the source, and then we're mapping them to Loink codes. And so there are examples like that. And I can try to show something more specific. It's like we're getting close to our end of our time here. FHIR defines a number of concept maps, but is there? I think we talked about that one. Well, maybe it's a similar one anyway. Let's see. It mentions it'd be interested in using an online SNOMED RT to SNOMED CT and inverse map. That's interesting. I mean, I think like a server like OntoServer possibly could have something like that already. I mean, SNOMED provides some of that, although it doesn't do much between SNOMED RT and CT. And I'm not sure that OntoServer supports going that far back. But it's something we could talk to Michael Lawley and Jim Steele and the folks about. That might be able to be done implicitly, but we'd have to. I'm not sure about the RT bit. And sometimes there's even some confusion about what SNOMED RT is. Some people think that's the legacy SNOMED, which is called, with the alphanumeric codes. But RT was actually sort of the new generation of SNOMED prior to the addition of the read codes. But we won't go into more details of that. But anyway, it'd be interesting. I'd like to see if we could help you with that need, if that's possible. So one other question. It looks like we got about 1 minute left, I think. HL7 create a concept map for. Oh, I already did that one. Okay. I think naming. Yeah. I don't see any other ones.
There is 2 more. Perhaps you have to refresh you. From Bob
okay.
Peters.
All right. Let's see. It's not refreshing well, I guess. I'm not sure I see which ones are new. Oh, NamingSystem. Yeah, that was Alexander's question. I don't know. Can you read the question, Storm? Which ones are new? I'm not seeing it. Are we out of time now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. We'll pick that up tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.